Hi, I am Madeline James, and today we are going to be talking about creating a kick-butt team or crew of characters. And I'm going to apologize, I'm still recovering from being sick. I've been sick for literally weeks. I had the flu, which went right into a really bad cold. So yeah, I'm still recovering a little bit. I sound a bit hoarse. But I have a bunch of notes. I've been planning to film this for quite a while. But it is a very, very common trope in fantasy and other genres to have this team of characters that have to work together. And it's not always combat, right? They're not always fighting. But you'll commonly see this in fantasy especially, but a lot of others, you'll see these in heist plots, in competition plots where, you know, the main character will team up with other competitors to create sort of a team to work together. You'll see it in a lot of just a lot of all these books. And I made a list of some of the big ones that I can think of just so that you can sort of contextualize what we're talking about here. But the Dregs in Six of Crows, the Calls in Greenbone Society, the Iron Squad in Fourth Wing, Aelin's friend group in Throne of Glass, the Fellowship of the Ring, obviously, the Firefly crew and passengers, and then Team Avatar from ATLA. Love them. So when creating a crew, it's really important that you have distinct characters, right? They all need to have their different strengths and weaknesses and personality. But even more than that, they need to have really good dynamics with each other in order to fuel conflict and interesting scenes and plot progression and also banter. If every character is doing the exact same things, then why do you have multiple characters, right? Sorry, my kids are being horribly loud right now. But yeah, I am at the point in my current book, my Magic Forged book, where I need to flesh out the team that the main character is going to work on when she is infiltrating the military gang. And I want that to actually be fleshed out because in draft 1, I did not flesh them out well. I think I threw in some random names at one point and then I referred to them in really abstract general terms throughout the book. Like, oh yeah, and the team was doing stuff. That was basically it. So now, draft 2, we're going through and fleshing that out. So when I was doing this before, the main two, teams that I did really deep dives into was Six of Crows and also ATLA. And I think these groups show how to do this really, really well, because not only is each character really distinct with really great weaknesses and strengths and all that stuff, but they have distinct relationships between each other. So every single person in the team has a different relationship and pulls out different sides of each character with each other, right? So in ATLA, Katara's relationship with her brother Sokka is very, very different from her relationship with Aang, which is very different from her relationship with Toph. And she has different struggles and conflict with each of those characters because they all pull on different parts of her personality, right? And so you really get to explore the characters really, really well through each of these interactions and see them in so many different angles and perspectives, because if you just have two characters, you're really only going to get, you could try to be a little bit more interesting with it, but for the most part, you'll sort of get one side of their personality pulled out. You're not going to see the full breadth of a character unless you see them in a lot of different situations with a lot of different types of conflict with different types of people, right? Because everyone acts differently in those situations. So it's a really good way to make your characters feel deeper, but also you have all these different types of interactions to pull conflict from and banter and all of that, which is awesome. So the first place that I started with all of this was Character by Robert McKee, which is up on my bookshelf, which is why I'm pointing at it. But he talks a lot about cast dynamics in character, about how all of... What? Okay, come here. Can I fix your brat for you too?
Sure.
Okay, come here. Goodbye. But yes, he talks a lot about cast dynamics, and this is for a whole show, right? Or a book, movie, whatever. And I've used this to an extent. And if you've watched my big character video, which I'll link down below if you want to watch that after this, I made myself a bunch of cheat sheets, both off of reframing the stuff in character to make more sense to me, as well as a number of other craft books and research and, looking into things myself. But this is some of what I reuse. So like, you know, I have this up in videos, but I have cast design, dimensions, you know, I have a bunch of, you know, stuff that I put together for myself. And I'm obviously not an expert, and I can only share what I've learned, but if you have more thoughts on this or other resources that you think would be really helpful or anything like that, please put it down below, because I am always learning and getting better at this, and I feel like every single time you do something, you get better at it, right? So let's start working on that real quick. Okay, I'm going to just put this up on the screen for you to look at, but I'm looking at my dimensions cheat sheet right now, and this sort of adds a bunch of notes about, you know, types of dimensions, way to add contradictions, but one of the big things about creating complex characters is, again, showing contradictions, and this is a big thing in both Robert McKee and a bunch of other books, but basically, that's what makes characters interesting, right? Where maybe they act one way externally, but then you get hints that inside they are or feel a different way, or they act a certain way in very specific situations, but then other times they act completely different ways. And I think you see this a lot, like, so thinking about like fantasy books, you'll typically see, you know, your big bad, morally gray, alpha hero or whatever, right, who's really gruff and strict and aggressive, and then you'll see that conflicted with, in certain situations, they're incredibly gentle and kind and compassionate, right? And, you know, we're not going to get into this too deeply, but essentially that can help you understand who they are and why they are the way they are at a much deeper level, because it's like, okay, well, if they have this inner heart that is so sweet and gentle, why did they become this way, right? Like, what happened in their past to make them feel like they have to be so tough and unemotional and aggressive, right? Because clearly they are kind and compassionate and have empathy and understand all of these things. But then also, whatever pushed them so far to that side, what is it that is so core to their personality and their ideals that they still are this way, right, in certain situations? So maybe it's, you know, if anything has to do with children, right, they are incredibly gentle and sweet and compassionate, you know, will help the little kids pick up their dolls and like run around and play with them or whatever, right? And why is that, right? You know, and that's really high level. You'd have to get into all of this more. And I don't remember how much I got into this in my character video, but if you want me to go like do a video on dimensions deeply, I can do that at some point, but it's not super duper relevant here. Let me go to the next page, which is my cast dimension map. And again, this kind of comes from Robert McKee. And so you have this idea where you have all of your main characters' dimensions. This whole purple block is main character dimensions. And then you have various types of side characters. So you can have major side characters that maybe they have 3 dimensions that pull off of different dimensions of the main character, right? So maybe you have a character that pulls out that really aggressive side, that really, you know, tough, whatever side of the character, but then maybe they have another dimension that pulls out their, like, love for baking. I don't know, right? Like, different ways that these characters are going to connect with each other, and some are going to provide conflict, which is, you know, that's what this little symbol is, the lines, that's conflict, right? And then at some point, that might pull to the opposite side, right, as they get to know each other, right? You have that initial conflict, tension, hatred, not understanding each other, and then when you understand them deeper, right, things get better. And so side characters might only have 1 dimension, and minor characters might just have a dominant trait, right, where they just are a certain way. It's not a contradiction within themselves, it's just a trait. So maybe this person is really, they're a party character, right? They always want to have fun. And you don't really get enough of that character to ever see the other side of them, right? Whereas in a side character, you might see that side, but then maybe on the inside, they're really tortured and have all this stuff they have to deal with, but they hide it behind this side of themselves that's always partying and having fun because they don't want to think about all this super dark stuff, right? So that's sort of the difference there. So I think the first step, right, to creating a kick-butt crew or team is to think about how significant these characters are, and then starting to figure out what these, you know, dimensions are going to be to pull off of each other. And I think it's perfectly fine to start with the ones that directly interact, right? And these can be all sorts of things. It could be like different political or societal stances, right? So maybe someone is in the nobility, right? And maybe someone is, a street urchin, right? And it's not that those specific things are what give them the dimension, it's the parts that's attached, right? So maybe the street urchin feels like, the nobility is always selfish and not caring, and that all they care about is wealth and money, right? So they have that prejudice against the nobility. And then maybe the nobility feels like, the poor have earned it, right? They deserve being poor and whatever because they haven't tried to pull themselves up, right? So maybe they both have these conflicting stances based off their societal, socioeconomic positions, right? That will cause immediate conflict. But then maybe that is contrasted with inner feelings that are going to eventually pull together. Like maybe the character has these misguided beliefs about the poor, but they're actually incredibly compassionate and understanding of people's struggles. They've just never been exposed to, poor people and why people are actually poor, right? So over the course of the novel, they'll learn more about that, and then that'll pull out that other side of their dimension. But I think you could start with just looking at what is going to initially give conflict, and then you can pull in, okay, but like, how is that going to develop over the course of a book, right? So I think that's step one. And in my case right in here, my main character is obviously very well developed. They have a lot of dimensions, and there's certain sides of them that I want to be pulling out in this situation. Because again, she is going to be not pretending, but like she's undercover, right? Working with this team. So the sides of herself that she's going to be showing that are going to be dominant in this situation is what I'm going to start with, right? So what I want to do is list out all of those sort of character traits and then figure out how I can work that out with the other characters. And something else I think to consider is, depending on the situation, these relationships don't have to bring change. If this is like the main team of all your main side characters, right, like it is in my heist book, then yeah, like you want to have all these different dimensions, you want to have all these characters growing and changing and building these relationships over time, and they're going to change, right, as they learn more about each other. But sometimes that's not what you're looking for, right? You want something that's already established or is a little bit more static, which is essentially going to be the case for my book, because most of the change is going to happen as the character kind of understands we'll say the motivations of her team. Like she's going to gain respect for them over time, but that's not necessarily going to be due to individual character interactions, right? Like I want something a little bit simpler. And then once we get that, then we'll start looking at, fighting mechanics and stuff like that. So if I go down to, let's get a notebook out. I need to get better about top-down shooting, but what I did here is I wrote down just some of the dimensions and the main misbelief that's going to be interacting with this group, right? And then I filled in each of the side characters I'm going to have in this team, right? And so there's going to be 5 of them. And I already know a lot about this character because she's one of my main side characters, so I just wrote down some of the most relevant things. But this character basically fills the role in the group of sort of like the expert prodigy, right? So like she's just really good at everything, specifically fighting, right? And then I've sort of started by giving each character a little bit of a sort of like a stereotype or archetype in the group. So like this character is going to be the quiet, watchful one. This one can be a little bit more paranoid and OCD. This one can kind of seem like they just are kind of lazy, don't have their own opinions, just do what they're told. And then I might have one that's like maybe a little bit too like trigger happy, like a little bit more violent. So we'll write that violent / trigger. And this is a little bit weird for me doing this with like intense characters, because like normally these are really crazy for me, but since these are all going to be really, really minor characters, like these ones at least, I want to keep it really surface level. But I have these high level sort of like roles they fill in the group. So then I want to think about my character and think about personality traits or behaviors that would be particularly interesting in contrast with my main character. So, like, her big misbelief with this group is she thinks all of them are selfish, power motivated, uncaring, ruthless, etc. And so, initially, I want her to both be getting sort of this back and forth pull of like, well, are they actually like that, or are they actually like good people, some of them, you know what I mean? So the ones I already know about this character is that they're very willing to help. They always want to offer advice. You know, they want everyone to be as strong and competent as they can be. And that really pushes against the main character who is very isolated and antisocial and can't work in a team, right? Like that is immediately going to cause some like push and pull. And then also they tend to party and they seem to kind of take it all as a joke, right? Which this character is more intense. So there's going to be a lot of underlying stuff with that like they're going to learn as they grow. But that's sort of, you know, the dimensions there. So then as I get down into character 2, who is really quiet and watchful, ways that could cause conflict here is maybe they don't speak out when something bad happens. So maybe don't speak out. Let's see, uncaring, ruthless, how would that show up here? I think not speaking out would be a big one. But maybe that contrasts with more quiet actions, you know? So maybe they don't speak out and they seem to be, complacent isn't the right word, but, I don't know, there's a word there, where they just kind of let things that shouldn't happen. But then their actions show that they actually think things are wrong. So actions contradict complacent silence. So if they're like bad people, well, that's a little bit too black and white, but like, you know what I mean? There's people in the military gang who are doing things for perhaps bad reasons. You know, maybe they just don't speak out about it. They just kind of nod and say whatever, but then they, you know, go around and their actions show something differently, right? When people aren't necessarily watching. And I could come up, if depending on how much time I wanted to spend with these characters on the page, like I could come up with some reason for that, why they wouldn't speak out, probably some sort of underlying trauma from a time when they did speak out and they've learned, you know, to keep their mouth shut. And that's, you know, words aren't going to do anything, but you know, they can still act in the right way when no one's watching. You know what I mean? Which has a lot of similarities with my main character. So that could be, if I have enough page time, an interesting way for them to bond, right? So this is going to give that sort of push and pull. And that's sort of, I guess, step 1, right? This is going to give us the conflict and interesting dynamics as we're trying to understand these characters and their motivations. But also, I'm going to want a way for the main character to like them. So, like, what is this character going to admire about these other characters? So, like, for Vanessa, she's going to admire her competence, right? Like, the main character is very competent herself. She works very hard to be self-sufficient and to be good at things. So that's something she would admire in this character. And then, obviously, like, the fact that she's, like, all up in her business and partying like it's all a joke are going to be things that she's not going to like. So I could add a note for, like, admire competence. And this other character who's, like, quiet and watchful, you know, it might seem very, like, timid, perhaps, which would be something that the main character, like, would look down on and assume that that's just, you know, her being weak, right? But then I think that she would actually admire maybe her observations or things she's noticed, you know, those actions, right? So we'll say admire observations. So that could be like maybe in a few scenes when they're in a situation where they don't know what to do and the character is unable to figure it out, then maybe this character can like come out, even though they're normally quiet and timid, and be like, this is some information I know or I've learned, and then that allows them to like move forward, and that would build a respect and a rapport between those characters. So that could help here. And then for this character, so I have them being kind of a little bit more paranoid, a little bit more OCD. So that could come out in a few different ways, right? Like that could always just be interesting quirk of things they do where it's not necessarily plot relevant. But if they're a military gang, it could make them seem like they're not brave, right? So maybe they seem not brave, which, you know, the main character is very noble, is very, thinks duty's really important. So by this character being a little bit more paranoid and worried about things, maybe they think they're not brave, no sense of duty. But then also maybe this paranoid OCD side comes out in them wanting to seem like they're following the rules of their superior. So follow rules to a T, even bad, right? Because they don't want to get in trouble. And that could, again, because those rules would potentially be coming from someone who is more power motivated, more ruthless, that could seem like they are supporting it themselves, right? Another way to both reinforce this, but then also, how would I pull out a side that the main character would respect? So I'll have to think about that, like how that would come out. Because you have the rule follower, but I mean, I guess this would almost be a good case for a dimension where they always want to follow the rules, but what is that line that they won't cross, right? I feel like that's always an interesting way for contrasting these, because, you know, even though it's simple, like you can kind of give hints of this with just small actions without a lot of page time, but maybe won't cross line, maybe endangering their team members, right? So maybe the whole book, you know, they're really intent on them following all the rules, on them not upsetting team leads or other people in positions of authority, right? And they're like, oh, well, even if this is bad, we got to do it or we're going to get in trouble, you know what I mean? But then as the second someone on the team is in danger, they step up and they will do nothing other than defend that person, right? And that loyalty is something that the main character would really, really respect, is that loyalty. So that could be how that character works. So then over here we have lazy, just do what's they're told. And I feel like lazy is maybe not what I'm aiming for here. Maybe it's more just like very indifferent to everything, right? Like, you know, they don't care. They're just there to do a job. And they don't really think much about it. And so they would probably be likely to just follow someone around, maybe someone who's less, I don't care, right, would sort of be their thing. And they would seem like a follower. And maybe they follow someone who isn't the best, right? So anyone who has, you know, power or is just going to have the confidence to tell someone what to do, they're just like, okay, whatever, let's do it. And so then that would want to conflict with some underlying personality trait, right, that the main character would be able to really respect. So we have competence, observations, loyalty, right? So what else would our main character really admire? She would probably really connect with someone. I mean, it could be someone who has similar struggles that she does, but I feel like that wouldn't fit quite as well for this group. I mean, she would really respect someone who's family-oriented, but I'm not really sure how that would show up unless maybe this character is related to someone else here, and they normally don't care. So that might be a little too similar to this contradiction, to where they will always follow the rules unless their team members are endangered. I don't know if that necessarily matters here, but maybe they have like a little sibling or something in the fort. And maybe, you know, they don't care, they do all this other stuff, but then they're super compassionate to their little siblings, right? And they really care about that. So maybe they're a really good big sibling. And so we could have like scenes when they're at the fort where they're, you know, incredibly kind and the opposite of lazy, right? So very active with playing and caring. You know, that could be really interesting because even though this character, right, might not care as much about, you know, some of the more, negative traits of some of the people in power, like they have that line where they protect their sibling and they're very active in playing and they care, and they may not care about anything outside of it, but with their sibling, they really, really care. So this is definitely a more gray character because there's no sense of underlying justice or nobleness or good motivations for other people. Like, this character probably doesn't care about injustices in the world and wouldn't necessarily step out of their way to help somebody, but they're still a really, really good big sibling. So I think this adds a slightly more gray character into here that would be really interesting. And that sibling relationships the main character would really, really respect and understand, even if, you know, they don't think they're a good person, like they're a good sibling, and that would mean a lot to the main character, if that makes sense. So let's go with that. And then this last one, violent and trigger happy. This one I think we have to be careful with. I think this is obviously going to, just at surface level, be something that the main character dislikes, right? Someone who's just violent, doesn't care, just wants to run in and, you know, F stuff up. That's going to not look good here. So the question is going to be like, why are they so violent and trigger happy? Is it because, how do you contrast that? I guess it could be, okay, let's think about this way, right? So this person, maybe they don't think things through before acting, right? And that could result in this character getting the team in danger, puts team in danger potentially. And this could also involve maybe them being excited or being gung-ho about some of the actions of the military gang. Anything that puts them in, you know, a fight is good for them, so they don't really care why or what they're doing, as long as they're getting to murder the beasts. So that could actually be something that they have in common with the main character, is just the hatred / willingness to kill all the beasts. And to an extent, like, that's a kind of bravery, right? And some of it could be foolish bravery, right? But what if we get a sign of hints that this character is actually very afraid of things, right? And that external bravery contradicts inner fear, right? So maybe inner fear, and maybe there could be like an underlying memory or something that fuels that. Like maybe the characters are all sitting there, the main character's sitting down with this one and is like, you know, how are you always, you know, fearless, running into danger? Like, don't you ever worry about X, Y, and Z, right? And this character is like, you know, of course I'm afraid. I'm always afraid. You know, this horrible thing happened, and every night when I go to sleep, I picture the beasts breaking into the camp and tearing everyone apart, right? And so maybe that fear is like the only way they know how to cope with it is just by running into danger, by just always being ready to go, because if they hesitate, they can't be brave anymore, right? So maybe hesitation would let fear in, right? And that could be a really, really interesting way to have this character and this character interact, right? Because this character also fears a lot of stuff, not the typical stuff that other characters would notice, right? Like she's not afraid of dying or putting her life in danger or any of those types of things, but she has a lot of really serious fear when it comes to, you know, her family and stuff like that. So she's very selfless in a lot of those ways, and so that would be a really interesting type of interactions between them potentially. So, okay, this gives us interesting character traits. This differentiates them, and this gives us ways both for the main character to dislike, but then also learn to respect these other characters. And this definitely got a little bit more involved than I expected it to, but I think it was necessary. So the next steps are going to sort of be their actual character traits, which I don't think we'll get super into, but I have, let's see, I have a list of things that I might want to think about for each character. So I might want to think about what are their motivations or goal within the group. So like maybe this character, right, who just is really afraid, their only goal is to hide that fear behind, killing the beasts. And that if they stop killing the beasts, they won't be able to cope anymore, and the fear will just leave them incapable of, acting or, existing. So that's their goal, is literally just to keep the fear at bay and keep killing beasts. And that's it, right? Maybe this character down here is their only goal is to, earn money and be there for their sibling and make sure their sibling has, the parent that they need to have. Right? Like maybe that's their only goal, right? Is to look out for this little sibling. Maybe this character's only goal is to fly under the radar. Maybe they have some sort of secrets, or maybe they have some sort of shameful situation in their past. Not that it, would actually be shameful, but something they feel a lot of shame and regret and blame for, that they're trying to make up for, like thinking about things like that for each character. And then their reasons to be there. This is less relevant here. It could be a little interesting to sit down and think about how they got in this situation, right? Like, these are all characters that have become soldiers in a military gang. And they could be a variety of ages, right? Some of them would probably be a little older, a little younger, but they're all probably going to be maybe mid-30s to mid-20s would probably be the age ranges for the most part, without having been put up into higher ranks. So then the question is, why did they decide to be a soldier? Based off this time period, this was 15 years after the Beast came. So all of these characters would not have been soldiers originally. They decided after the apocalypse, whatever, that they wanted to be soldiers. And so why did they choose to do that? Like, what brought them there, right? So like this character, like maybe the way to get their sibling access to certain like medicines. Maybe their sibling is sick, and so they need access to certain medicines, and the only way they can get access to that is through this military gang that basically controls trade, right? So they're like, yeah, I don't freaking care. I'll go and kill beasts and do whatever you tell me to do, as long as my sister has access to this medicine, right? Like that could be why they're there. Maybe this character was saved by the gang, so they don't believe that the gang is actually like maybe they do bad things, but it's like they saved my village and yada yada, right? Like they will all have reasons that could come out in conversations and in arguments, right? Where they're justifying themselves and their actions. I also have secrets and lies. I don't think I'll really get into that with this character group, because they're not going to have quite enough page time for that. But I always think it's really interesting to give characters things that they're hiding, right? Things that they don't want the main character to know. And that those could be just parts of themselves they don't want shared, or things that they, like, oh, they don't want someone to know that they're actually really afraid, right? It could be something as simple as that, or it could be something really dangerous and significant. Then there are misbeliefs or wounds. And this goes into more if you're having a group that is going to be sort of growing together, right? And the other characters are going to be helping them overcome some of these things. So I'm not going to do that so much here. Things they need and their dreams. What does this character really want? What is it that would actually make them as a character fulfilled, So like for this character, maybe they need to overcome some of that fear, right? Like they look like they're never afraid and that they're always brave, but like all of their actions are actually fueled by fear. And so they need to conquer that underlying fear in order to make less, reckless decisions, right? That sort of thing. Triggers. So this again gets into more if you have the misbelief wound thing, but like what is going to trigger this character, right? So like this character, their sibling, right, is their soft spot. Anything having to do with the safety and well-being and enjoyment and happiness of their sibling is going to be something that is going to set them off, right? So they may seem like they don't care about anything, but then the second something's going to affect their sibling, they're going to be mad, right? And you can play around with that with a lot of these characters, right? Of, what is going to trigger them. So maybe this character doesn't speak out and they're super quiet and watchful, but there might be a trigger for that, right? So what if, What if they got in really big trouble at some point because they burned a bunch of drugs, right? Threw away drugs that the military gang, some of the people in it were hawking or something, right? Got in huge trouble, had to keep their mouth shut. Like maybe they spoke out about someone doing something they weren't supposed to do as part of that. And so maybe that ties into this wound where people are hiding things from superiors and kind of just letting things go. So maybe they don't speak out, but when they see someone else that is essentially hiding someone doing something bad for them, you know, in a position of authority, maybe that makes them really mad and they act out in a certain way for this character, right? Which might not be speaking out, but it might be like, maybe they play pranks on them. And by play pranks, I mean like, maybe they're pretty deadly pranks or something, right? Like, maybe they do something like that in those cases to seek vengeance for the people that she got in trouble for trying to, like get in trouble, like make them accountable for their actions. And when she sees other people not putting other people accountable, she gets even, right? So maybe that's, you know, how this character is triggered, right? Like you can play around with that. Lines they won't cross or limits. And I think this is, you know, in simplest terms, this could be like someone won't hurt kids, but they'll hurt anybody else. Maybe it's someone who won't share personal information about themselves, right? Like they'll be as happy and charismatic and chat about funny things and be, you know, super charismatic. But the second you ask them a personal question, that's it. Conversation cut off, right? Could be anything like that. But then let's get into the fighting side of it. So the thing with these characters, right, is this is a fighting group. And each of these characters needs to have a different role within the team. And, you know, you'll have to do a lot of research on what makes sense for the characters to have in terms of a team. But for the most part, this group is going to be going around in, like, patrols, right? And keeping eyes out for beasts and potentially killing beasts, guarding caravan shipments, that sort of a thing, right? So I already know that this character is going to be, like, super competent fighter, right? So they're probably one of the, like, frontline members of the group, right? That's going to engage immediately, probably, like, second to the team lead. So maybe this person is, like, near the front. Maybe they're, like, the deputy sort of the team, right? And then some of the characters might be, you know, scouts, right? Like, one of these characters, maybe they're the scout that goes forward and keeps an eye out for things. Maybe one of these characters are like the archer, right? Like there's other positions for them to have in this sort of a group. So I want to figure out what all those are, but then also what their fighting style is based off their personality, right? So like this character, they obviously run headfirst into danger, right? They are ready to take anything on. This is going to be a melee fighter, right? In order to fit all of that. So I could write like melee and run into battle. So I can see this person and this character being sort of those frontline people to engage, probably near the like middle front of the group. And then one of these potentially would maybe be the scout. It could make sense for this person to be the scout, but it could also be interesting for this one to be the scout, giving their like paranoia and OCD. Like maybe this character is really annoying as a scout because they always make people stop and listen and like, you know, that sort of a thing. So that could be really interesting. And it would also fit this character who's really quiet and watchful. But this person, maybe they watch the rear. Maybe they're a ranged fighter. Like these all would have melee fighting abilities because like they're fighting beasts. But maybe this one is more defaults to ranged. So we'll say ranged, watch, rear. And that's their typical role, right? And then maybe this character is sort of the scout. Where they maybe signal when to move, etc. To move / wait, right? And that could add some interesting conflict here. And so then this character, I feel like they would just be kind of like in the middle. They're just there. They're not going to run straight into danger, but they're going to fight when they have to, right? So we'll say that's like mid-rear in terms of the group, right? So we might have, if we were working through the trees, right? Which This is kind of weird, but like, maybe this is our road. There's trees on either side. You might have our scout, number 3, up ahead, giving signals back, and then you might have, this is number 1, but maybe number 1 is here, maybe number 5 is here, kind of at that front end part. Maybe number 4 is like here. Maybe number 2 is slightly further back, right, watching the rear. And then the question would be, where would this main character fit in? And they would probably end up being over here, right? They're the ranger also, but they're probably not going to be trusted yet to be in the rear. So like this would sort of be the formation, how they'd move. It gives me ideas of how they would fight. And then I just need to figure out like, well, what are their weapons going to be? And I'm not going to do this on the video, but this kind of has to do with what kind of enemy they're fighting, right? The fact that this team, they're not fighting other people, they're fighting beasts. That really affects the types of weapons that they have. But I'll need to figure that out. And then fighting weaknesses is another thing I have in my notes. And I think this is important, right? So things they're not going to be the best at and things they're going to struggle with, like situations they're going to struggle with. And this can depend on like how competent you want these characters to be. Maybe they don't do well when cornered. Maybe they don't hold formation well. Maybe they can't fight more than one person at a time. Maybe they don't do well when they're distracted, right? Like all these types of things that they might need to work on that aren't even that technical. Obviously, they could have technical struggles that they need to work on too. Like maybe this one character is really good ranged, but kind of really struggles with melee. So the other characters have to kind of, when it gets into melee range, they have to really like protect this character, right? Like stuff like that. And it also could be like their physical advantages and weaknesses. Like maybe certain characters are a lot smaller. And so they have to be, more agile. They have to really take advantage of the size and weight of other things, right? Like there's a lot of ways to pull into that, but I like to think about the types of scenarios they're going to encounter, right? So this is going to be the main one, right? They're on a patrol through the forest. And then think about when there is an enemy, right? Say beasts come in. How are they going to act based off their personalities, based off their sort of roles in the fighting group? And then how is that going to interact with the main character, right? Like the main character is a ranger. Is that going to cause conflict with the other ranged character, right? Like could they have different styles? Could they have different beliefs on how, shooting arrows at people should be done, right? Like maybe one character is a lot more hesitant to shoot into a melee. Like stuff like that, where then they could argue about it. And then just in general, getting all of that written out. And what I would probably do is make a little page for each separate character and go over like also like what they might look like a few important characteristics that kind of tie into their personalities and their roles here, what their behavior is going to be. And this is all like character stuff, but like what are lines that they would say based off these things, right? Things that would show the negative things that the main character isn't going to like, but then also ones that are going to hint at like adding that respect in. And just coming up with like lists of things they could say in dialogue, right? And that's something I really like to do just to kind of give myself inspiration for when I get to writing scenes, so that I can work in ways to understand all of these characters. But I think that is probably good for this. So the next step, I think once you have this kind of idea of the characters, how they interact with your main character, all of that stuff, is to think about those relationships between the different characters, right? How are they going to interact with each other? How are they going to behave? How are their relationships going to be different with each other? And again, like, I'm not going to have enough page time to really get into every single one of those different dynamics. I'll probably pull out a few where this character only behaves this way with this other certain character. Like, I could see, like, number 1 and number 5, I could see them totally partying together, right? I could see them drinking, I could see them, doing all of that together and being the more rambunctious ones of the group. And so, like, I'll just think about little interactions like that could make it feel realistic. And I think that the step that we did where we talked about, okay, what are they going to dislike about this character? What's going to provide conflict? But then what are they going to respect and like about that other character, you would do that in every single direction between all of them, to make that feel really in depth. And that's what I did for my heist book. And I have a whole video where I talked about the character stuff if you want to see that a little bit. It took a lot of work and I had to tweak a lot of things, and that whole book is basically just like, it's very, very character driven, right? There's a lot of like plot as well, but a lot of it is just them interacting. There's going to be a ton of dialogue. Almost everything is going to be fueled by the team either not being able to work together and then being able to work together. So I don't think that that level of depth is necessary all the time, right? Like in ATLA, you have many, many episodes, so much time to focus on different characters and different relationships and really develop all of those separately, and also their group dynamics. Whereas if you had like a movie version of Avatar: The Last Airbender, you would not get nearly that much depth in the interactions and the individual characters. And so you have to think about wanting things to be cohesive, right? Like if you develop all this super in-depth interactions but you can't show it, then nothing's going to really hit and come out as being, I don't want to say super dominant, right? But like it'll be hard to tell what's actually going on. So I think it's important to think about that, right? Like how significant is this going to be? How much page time is this going to have? For then developing that out and seeing how much detail you can put into it. Because like I can't give all of these characters tons of page time. Like they'll probably be in like 5 to 8 scenes, right? And there's just not enough time to get into all of that without it being entirely told and not shown, which is okay in some extents, but you know, that's sort of the next step. So I think this gives me most of what I need. I'm going to go through now and just, you know, again, I'll find like, I like to use inspo pictures for people just to help me like mentally visualize things. So I'll find pictures for each of them. I have a list of names I want to use, so I just need to assign them out and then build up any other characters I might need. So like the one character that has a sibling, that character is going to show up right at some point. So I'll want to make sure I show them. And then anyone else that like ends up being relevant, I'll want to figure out who they're related to in the gang, like if their family is also in the gang, because that would affect things, right? If they have like parents that are there versus if they don't, or if they have kids or significant others, right? I'll want to think about that. But in general, that's kind of the start of the process and how I kind of go about figuring this out. I don't know if that was super duper helpful for you, but I needed to do it anyway, so I thought I'd share my process. But yeah, if you have any thoughts on this, please let me know. And, you know, again, I just think it's good to be intentional about all this stuff and very fun. But yes, I'm going to go finish fleshing out my notes for this, assign the names and everything, and keep writing. And I will see you next time.